There might be some folks trickling in, so as they do so, we will get started with the introductions though. Today's webinar is focusing on tips, tricks, and advice for publishing in various formats and sources, part one. And I just want to let you all know we will have a part two in February. So any questions that we don't tackle today, we will definitely get into in our February webinar. So keep your eyes open for advertisements about that upcoming webinar. So before we begin, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. While we meet here on a virtual platform, we should take a moment to recognize the importance of the land on which we are each located. We acknowledge the territory to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in building positive relationships between nations and in developing a deep understanding of Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, First Nations, and Métis peoples. And we do invite you to learn more about the territory on which you reside, and you can learn about that at the website native-land.ca. My name is Nicole McNair, and I am the chair of the Student Concerns Subcommittee this year. I'm a fourth year PhD student at McMaster University, and I am coming to you today from Toronto. And the City of Toronto acknowledges that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. The city also acknowledges that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Now, just for a couple of housekeeping rules before we get started, there will be Zoom-generated closed captioning and translation available if you look under the live transcript. Also, if you could please save your questions, which may be entered through the Q&A. We will be addressing questions after the initial discussion. Some of you have also submitted questions through our Instagram social media account, which has been wonderful, and those will be included throughout the discussion as well. Please note that your name and question will be visible to all attendees. If there is a question that you see that you would like asked, you can always upvote for that question to add it to the top of the list. And we do want to get into this because we've got lots of questions. So without further ado, I introduce you our wonderful panelists for today. We have Dr. Alex Bierman from the University of Calgary. Alex Bierman is professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Calgary. His research examines how social inequality conditions both exposure to stress and the consequences of stress as individuals age. He has published over 50 peer-reviewed papers and co-edited the Handbook of Sociology of Mental Health, which has been accessed online over 750,000 times. Dr. Bierman also recently co-edited the ASA journal, Society and Mental Health. Welcome, Dr. Bierman. And next we have Dr. Chantelle Richmond from Western University. Dr. Chantelle Richmond, Bigtikong Nishnabeg, is a professor of geography and environment and Indigenous studies at Western University, holding the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Health and the Environment. Her research examines Indigenous health and knowledge systems in relation to environmental change, focusing on the concept of environmental repossession. Dr. Richmond has mentored more than 50 students directly during her 18 years at Western, and it is that part of the work that inspires her most. Her achievements include membership in the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars and the fellowship in the Royal Canadian Geographic Society. In 2023, she was Fulbright Canada Research Chair at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And next, we have Dr. Lisa Jo Vandenschot from Memorial University. Lisa Jo Vandenschot is a professor of sociology at Memorial University. Her most recent book, Walled In, Arctic Housing and a Sociology of Walls, connects to her research interests in space, place, time, qualitative methods, architecture, and science and technology studies. She had served as an associate editor for the Journal of Empirical Research on Human Research Ethics and is currently the editor-in-chief of the journal Symbolic Interaction. Welcome, and thank you so much to all of you for being here today. It's really great to have a panel with varied experience because we do have varied researchers as our student membership here. So I'm sure they have lots of different answers, and I encourage you to please use your experience when answering questions because we have so many different students with different backgrounds and it'll be helpful to all of them. So before we get started with the questions, though, I would like to offer you each a moment to introduce yourselves and add anything that maybe I missed in the initial bio. And if you would like to talk a little bit about your research or your experience with publishing or sitting on editorial boards as well, that would be wonderful. And maybe we'll start in reverse alphabetical order this time and start with Dr. Lisa Joe and then Scott.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here. I was quite honored to be asked and excited to talk about this topic. Um, so my book, Walled In, that was mentioned in the introduction, I lived in Nunavut for 5 years before even starting my PhD, and I uh, worked with the community there to figure out a research topic and to write this book about essentially what it's like to live within Western colonial space and the power, architecture and power, and have to visit the locus of your traditional knowledge. And so, looking at Arctic housing and culture, um, now, in line with my interests in space, place, and time, I'm actually interviewing faculty about their offices because I think the state of universities is worrisome, and that's sort of an intersection where a lot of different things come together or not. It's also a space where we legitimize certain kinds of knowledge and not other kinds of knowledge. So there's problematic aspects too, but also how do we just develop our relationship with those spaces? And what do we think about ourselves and where that's going? And I think that will help us understand ways to decolonize, for example. Um, yeah, so that's a little bit more about me, and feel free to ask questions about that.
Thank you so much. And next, Dr. Chantelle Richmond.
Okay, well, thank you, Nicole, and good afternoon to everyone. Bonjour, Gisas Kwedeshnakas, Makododem, Bikit Tugong, Nishnabek, and Dunjba. I've just introduced myself in Anishinaabe which is the language of my mother and my maternal side of the family. My father is a settler from Newfoundland, or was a settler from Newfoundland. So Lisa, I'm feeling you through the across the vibes. Um, yeah, so I'm sitting here in London, Ontario. I've been a faculty member at Western since 2007. I actually did my undergrad and my master's training at McMaster. So love McMaster, love Hamilton. And then went to McGill for my PhD. Had just a year of a postdoc at U of T. So been around to lots of different places before coming here, but working fully in Indigenous contexts as a geographer. So I guess that's the special thing about me on this panel today is that I'm a geographer and I actually focus on Indigenous health geographies. We look at, I guess, the relationship between people and places and kind of like how environments shape the health of Indigenous people across broad, deep scales, right? So looking at both health and environment from lots of different ways. So just following what Lisa has said, especially I'd say since I became a faculty member, most of my research and publishing has been done in and with community members, with students, which is much more complicated and time consuming than as a student when I was working with, large scale data sets. So things look different. And so it's really nice to sit on this panel where we have a lot of different perspectives and not to say that doing quantitative research and publishing in that area is easier because I think there are always going to be ethical issues um, and I suppose that's part of what we'll talk about. So I'll pass it over to Alex if that's okay.
All right. Thank you, Chantelle. Yeah, my name is Alex Bierman, University of Calgary. I guess I'm the quant person on this panel. That's really what I specialize in. I analyze large scale surveys, but I especially specialize in longitudinal data analysis and really trying to understand, move just beyond an association to try and understand causes and effects. Um, I am a sociologist. That's what my degree is in, but I actually have a foot in two camps because the topic of my most of my research these days is on aging. So I actually do a lot with gerontology. So, for example, I was recently, as Nicole mentioned, co-editor of the ASA journal Society of Mental Health, but I'm also on the editorial boards of Research on Aging and Journals of Gerontology, Social Sciences. So I can speak to people who want to do more interdisciplinary work as well as sociology specifically. And that is something you have to think about when you're starting to publish that hopefully I'll be able to talk about later. And currently, one other thing I want to say is, and I mainly focus on articles. That's mainly what I do. And so I'm not sure if I'll ever publish a book, and no disrespect to people who publish that, but just doesn't interest me right now anyway. Who knows about the future? And the last thing I'll say is currently what I'm doing is leading a SSHRC-funded study called the Caregiving, Aging, and Financial Experiences Study, or CAFE study, where I'm analyzing data I gathered in a national longitudinal study of older adults, looking at how financial stress affects mental health and also psychological marginalization, like feeling like you're powerless, you matter less, and you have less social support and things like that.
Thank you all so much. I'm sure that your research resonates with at least, quite a few people on in the audience today. And so I'm sure, regardless of your specific experiences, you will be able to speak and to a target audience, I guess, today. That all said, let's just jump right into the questions. And as I mentioned, this is a part one of part two. So we are going to start from the very beginning. So if a student wants to publish a paper, should they write a paper first and then look into how and where to publish it? Or should they be thinking about things like word limitations and formatting, citation formatting, or which specific journals they would like to submit to before they begin writing so that they have an idea of how to structure their paper? So I guess kind of like a chicken and the egg question, what comes first? And how about Dr. Richmond? We start with you this time.
This is a great question. And I read it and thought for sure that they should try to write it for the publication, but I've changed my mind. I just changed my mind. Writing is really hard. Writing is really hard. It's really hard when it's your first time trying to write a publication. It's really hard when you're like you've got an H index of 39 and you've done it many times. Like I think that figuring out the message that you want to send and writing it in a way that makes good sense is always the most important thing, right? And so this means knowing that you are offering a great roadmap for your reader, that you are, so I would say figuring out not only the kind of like, what is this paper, but what are the key concepts I'm introducing? Where did they come from? Like offering that really nice literature review, and then thinking through like your methods. So what is it that I'm actually doing with these concepts? Where did they, what methods am I adopting and why? How am I analyzing the data? What tools am I using? What decisions am I making along the way? Like all of these things have to be very clear. And irregardless of what journal, and maybe not irregardless, but I would say generally irregardless of the journal, you really need to have that clear arc, right? And so that you've got like a really clear purpose, really clear set of objectives. You've outlined a nice intro that tells the reader where you're going and why. And then you give them the background info, the methods, and then all of this really juicy data that they really want to see. So when you're transforming that really nice paper that you've learned how to do, right? You've learned how to do some analysis, you've learned how to write a lit review. When you're transforming that into a publication, like it's not always easy to do, right? And I think that is the time when you start to imagine maybe what journal you want to go to. So if you've, say, written a master's thesis, for example, and I know this is a student wants to publish a paper, and they're working from the paper to the publication. Like if you have a master's thesis that is, say, 125 pages, or I don't even know how many thousand words that is, and you've only got now 8,000 words, which might include your bibliography, like you have to do a whole lot of like scrimping. And so I really truly think that knowing your story is the most important thing, and that you can work within the confines, or the, and I don't want to say confines, but work within the framework of a publication. Um, I think that's probably the best way. It may not be the best way. It's one way. Maybe I'll just end there.
I love what you said about knowing your story, and I've written that down. I will keep that in mind as I work through my writing. Dr. Bierman, did you want to jump in next?
So I knew I was going to do that sooner or later. Yeah, sure. Happy to. Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting what Chantelle was talking about because I see where Chantelle is coming from. At first, I was thinking, oh, I don't agree with that. But actually, I kind of do because I can see what Chantelle is saying. I take a little bit of a different approach, but I think it gets us to the exact same place, which is, to me, the first thing you should do with your research is figure out what your research question is. And it's bizarrely harder than it sounds. What I always tell graduate students, I've literally had like eyes open when I say this is, okay, a research question is a question that ends in a question mark, a sentence that ends in a question mark. And so if you're not ready, I mean, a paper should be about one thing because often what I get when I get students coming to me is they've run some sort of multiple variable model where they've got a lot of stuff in the model and they want to talk about a lot of things. Like, no, a paper is about really should be about one thing. So ultimately, if you're writing a paper, you should be able to state your overall research question in one sentence that ends in a question mark. But so I completely agree with Chantelle. Essentially, and we're just thinking of two different ways to get to the same place. We're talking about a story or your research question, but it's getting there. But I'll just say two other things on this topic. The first one is I think the first thing you should do before you think about a journal or maybe even submitting something to a journal is think about what the gap in the literature you're trying to address is. So I'm not a big fan of research that's personally relevant. I'm a big fan of thinking about the sociology as a field and thinking about what is the field missing. And what I often tell students is go look at a major journal, either in sociology, something like Social Forces, or in your discipline. If you study family, Journal of Marriage and Family, Health, JHSB, criminology. But you get my point here, demography, and look at, say, the last 3 years of issues of those major journals and just read the articles and read what's interesting to you and think about, okay, then now you're looking at the major journal in your field and you're looking at what's most recent. So where do we go from here for a paper that's interesting to you? What's the next step? Maybe what you want to think is maybe I'll bring in another theory that people haven't thought about that would enrich this line of research. Maybe it's something as simple as they're really missing something here, but it doesn't have to be that. It has to be how can I extend this? Not just how could I question this, but if someone's using theory A and you think, but if I bring in theory B and do a study using that kind of motivation, this may give new insight to this line of research. Something along those lines. The other thing I'll say on this topic is once you've identified your research question, what the gap in the literature you're trying to address is, you shouldn't think about a journal. You should think about 3 journals because the likelihood of any journal you submit to is it's going to be rejected. So you need to be thinking, this is what I do. I don't think about the journal I'm going to submit to. I think about, well, when that gets rejected, what's the next journal I'm submitting to? And optimally, what's the next journal after that? And because this all goes back to the last thing I'll talk about, which is audience. And let me give you an example. Say you want to look at the effect of parental divorce on child's self-concept. So that could be qualitative or quantitative. I purposely chose this example because of that. Well, think about the different journals you could submit this to. You could submit this to Lisa Joe's journal. You could just submit this to Social Psychology Quarterly. You could submit this to Journal of Marriage and Family. You may be able to submit this to Society of Mental Health. You could submit this to a general interest journal, like, say, Social Currents. Each of those journals will have a different audience, which means you need to write the paper differently. You need to maybe frame it with different references, but certainly with how you frame the paper overall as this is why this paper is of interest. A paper that is of interest to a family journal may not necessarily be the same kind of paper that's of interest to, say, Social Psychology Quarterly, even if it's not the same general topic. So it's not so much targeting. I do think you need to target a journal, but I think you need to target an audience and think about the different journals that you're going to submit to as you kind of fall down the apple tree. And that's where I'll stop with this.
That was so helpful. I'm taking so many notes. Thank you. And Dr. Vanden Scott, I'll pass it over to you.
Sure. This is great advice for my colleagues, so I won't bang on for too long so we can go on. But I will say Scott Harris, who was the previous editor-in-chief of Symbolic Interaction, had a great analogy, which I find extremely helpful. He said it's like picking a journal, it's like, and thinking if, is this the right journal? It's like playing along with a song, with a genre of music, right? Does my article fit with the kinds of things this journal typically publishes, right? And so the examples given are great because you can sort of cast them in different lights, but then you want to make sure you're familiar with the journal you're submitting to because I can't tell you how many times I'll get something that the topic is interesting, the method is in line with the journal. They do not address the theoretical approach of the journal at all. And they don't need to if they're publishing elsewhere, but if they're trying to publish in this journal, they need to. And, or for example, um, I'll get something that is laid out very differently than it would be stylistically laid out in the journal. So we don't usually have um, hypotheses, for example, in this particular journal. They are fabulous for journals where that's standard. And some journals, some do, some don't. You have to become familiar with the journal to know if that's on the go there. Ours can have them, but there's certain ways when they're sort of set aside. There's sort of a way of writing it that I can look at it right away and go, this person is not really writing something in line with the kinds of things we publish in this journal. So it's like a piece of music. It's like learning a genre of music. You have to learn how to play along to that song. And so I would say it's, little things like formatting. I think we make a big deal about that, especially when we're students and we're going through, because it's something we can control that's easy to say, okay, am I doing this right or wrong? And once you get into publishing in academia, there's not a lot of like, am I doing this right or wrong? There's a lot of like, am I theorizing? Should I go down this road and apply this theory as, or should I? And so, but part of becoming a good academic is kind of being able to take some agency in those directions of where your work goes. And formatting, I mean, you can do that last once you really, and you might have to. I think it's an excellent idea to pick three journals, and one might be APA, and one might be ASA, and MLA, and that reformatting is pretty easy to do. I wouldn't stress about when I'm initially writing it, how I do that. But I think it's a kind of an iterative process where you go back and forth because you have to start writing your analyses up, and as you do that, and your literature review, and as you do that and you find the right groove, that will shape what journals you look at. But also ask yourself, what journals am I citing a lot of? Right? And so then go to those journals, read those journals. Not only may they have more helpful work for your lit review, but you'll figure out if you're kind of on the same page and then going to be printed on the same page as those journals. So I would just add that at this point.
Can I say one other thing?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Lisa, that was such an excellent comment. I just want to support that because at Society and Mental Health, we had the highest rejection rate in the of all the journals in the American Sociological Association. It was exactly what Lisa was talking about. Sorry, Lisa Joe, in that um, in that people would just read the title of the journal and send us something on mental health. And it was, I would look, if someone was submitting from halfway around the world, I don't know if they had access to our journal. I was pretty forgiving. When somebody from a really powerful university, I won't name any names, but somebody outside of sociology at a powerful university, I don't know, I won't name names. We'll just call it Marvard. When somebody from that, again, not naming names, when someone from that university where you knew they had access to the journal and could have just taken 5 minutes to look at it and say, oh, this is not a public health journal. You really need to at least give the journal a good look. And the other thing you need to think about is, as Lisa just said, is what perspective are they working from? Because the most common reason we would desk reject papers, and we desk rejected all the time, was mainly what I did as an editor. And for those who don't know, just reject means we won't even send this out for review. It's not going to work. No, sorry, thank you, goodbye. And we did that a lot. I would say I did that 90% of review of submissions in the first year we were there, and stuff started getting better in terms of what they were submitting. So by the end, it was 85%. And without question, the most common reason that we desk rejected was that people would not set their papers within theory in the sociology of mental health. And so we literally had a form letter that we would say, this journal sponsored by the section on the sociology of mental health. You need to appeal to that audience. You haven't set this paper to appeal to that specific audience. And so that's something you really need to think about. Thank you, Lisa Jo. That was great.
Can I add one thing?
Of course.
Because as soon as Lisa Jo started to talk about that, I just have to second what Alex has just said. A student of mine wrote a very beautiful paper, and she sent it to the wrong journal. And it was desk rejected. And I was on holiday at the time, so she didn't want to bug me, but she was just kind of like it is really miserable getting the desk reject. It's even worse getting like the rejection with the commentary, which maybe we'll talk about, I'm not sure. But I would say the desk reject is not that it's bad scholarship. It's that it might be. It might be that you did not follow the rules and you didn't do all the things you're supposed to do. Because half of the battle really is writing something good, following the rules, which are very well laid out. Um, you know, but also like making sure that it is the right journal for your scholarship, right? And so it's not a desk reject. I just want everybody to hear it might just be the wrong journal. It's not that what you've written is bad or wrong or that you should quit academia altogether and leave your PhD. It's just that you sent it to the wrong place.
Thank
I
you.
would just stress that we all get rejections. The most famous sociologists, geographers, anybody you can think of have had rejections, including desk rejects. And one of my parents was at a conference once where these very famous people brought their rejection letters to read them out, which I thought was fabulous because then you can realize someone like, if you do grounded theory, Kathy Sharmas was there and read out like, this is terrible work. I mean, so yeah, not letting it get to you the same way. I think you do need a thick skin and to know it's not personal and fit counts. The name of my journal is Symbolic Interaction. People send me all the time anything remotely related to symbols, whereas symbolic interaction is a specific theoretical approach, right? So yeah, this is the issue.
Thank you all so much. And I'm really glad actually that you spoke a little about rejection because it is such a common practice, but it's something that can be so challenging and difficult. And it's funny, I was at a conference once and in the open room, we were celebrating accomplishments. So it was like, okay, has anyone had this? Raise your hand. Has anyone had this happen this year? Raise your hand. And one of the questions was, okay, who's had a desk reject this year? And the number of hands that went up was astounding. So it is very much a part of academia. So thank you all for addressing that. But you've also been talking a bit about like layout and structuring and things like that. So the next question is, when it comes to structuring a paper, are there any unwritten guidelines or rules that editorial boards like to see that students should know about? Would these structural considerations be applicable to most journals and to different types of papers? So for example, quantitative versus qualitative. So again, just based on your experience, are there kind of specific structural things that are standardized or specific to different types of research? And maybe we'll start off with Dr. Vandenscott.
Sure. So, again, this does go in line with being familiar with the journal you're submitting to. You should have read at least a few articles from that journal, at least, and read the author guidelines. Um, but some things around structure, I mean, if you are submitting a, um, a paper to a qualitative journal, for example, and it's 2,500 words, immediately my radar's going off, right? Doesn't seem on. And similarly, if you submit an article that's 20,000 words, not only is that not on, no reviewer is going to take that on. We won't even send that out for review because nobody will agree to review it. So, length, I think, is something. Look at the sort of average length in the journal. They will have in the guidelines word length, and if they have any structural instructions, they will lay them out there. Um, for our journal, 8,000 to 10,000 words is sort of the average. We're a little bit longer because we do a lot of ethnography and that kind of thing. Um, Alex can speak to quant journals, I'm sure, and but it's important to just follow the guidelines. Most of those are there. Unwritten ones are just the things that if you are familiar with the journal, you will see, you will become, read a few articles and does it usually have this kind of section? Is it a journal? Sometimes discussion section is after the findings and sometimes it's embedded within it. What's the norm for that field? Again, go to the journal. Most quant work or positivist work, you have a discussion after the findings. A lot of grounded theory work, it's within the findings. So again, becoming familiar with the journal, you follow that melody.
So maybe Dr. Richmond, I'll throw it to you first, and then we'll hit the quant stuff afterwards.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that Lisa just said that's really important is the guide for authors. So all journals will have some form of how to do publishing for this, what is expected um, for this journal. And obviously, doing what's expected in the guide for authors doesn't mean it's interesting or that that you should be published, but it at least gets you in the door, right? And all of these things are, likely expected. Like you might need to have a title page, and you've got to have some acknowledgments. You've got to acknowledge funders. Um, so and this isn't about structuring the paper as much, but there will be reference information in the guide for authors that tells you what you should do and how the paper should be laid out. And this may refer to things like you should have an appendix that includes maybe the questions that you asked, the interview questions that you asked, or your other data collection. It may actually include data, like so I really think that knowing the journal well, so once you know your story, once you know what it is that you've written, what it is that you have found, and why it matters for your field, coming to decide upon a journal, is a critical step. But then I think knowing what the journal looks like, and both Alex and Lisa Jo have said, read articles from that journal. Familiarize yourself with like, oh, okay, intros are generally like a page long. Like there is in some journals, there's actually like there is, a very familiar layout. And so if and I don't think these things necessarily have to be like limitations or, you know, like like colonizing. I think they're actually like good structures and good parameters to help you lay out your work in a really good way. But I always tell my students, go and read other examples because those examples are really good guidelines for thinking about um, even just thinking about like where the discussion goes and how much discussion happens early on. Are the conclusion and the discussion in the same place? Um, so I think I'm repeating things, but I think because they're really important. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned about structure. I'm very resistant. I always try to break structures. So I'm thinking like, should I write an original paper, or should I follow the structure? So I'm glad you kind of touched on that as well.
I think that if you want to do your original structure, you should do that in your PhD. Because if you're like, and I'm sorry to come back, but I just wanted to say I have seen so many different PhDs in my lifetime of review. And that is the one place where I think, because if you actually look at, what are the criteria for a successful PhD? It must be original. There are very few criteria about what a PhD, it has to some original analysis of data or something like that. Outside of that, it's very like it's open, right? And so there are expectations, of course, normative expectations around like chapters and so on. But I have seen like Indigenous authors or Indigenous students write fully in their own language. And sometimes even when there's a collection, say a PhD that's a collection of manuscripts, sometimes the linking text or the intro or the conclude or they can look very different. So I do think that if you want to be expressive, that is a good place to do it.
Thank you. I think I personally needed to hear that. So thank you very much for that. All right, Dr. Bierman, would you like to add some points about structure?
Yeah, I'd also like, thank you. I'd also like to respond to that last point about structure. I think that was a great leaping off point because here's a different perspective on that, which is your editor is if the editor is going to send this out to review, is going to be desperate for reviewers. It is increasingly difficult to find reviewers for papers. So reviewers who are willing to review papers are often overwhelmed. And that was a serious challenge we had at Society and Mental Health. And I've heard from other editors that's the same issue. And so I understand what you're saying about breaking structure, but I think at this point it'd be useful to take the role of the other person, which is the harder you make it for a reviewer to sit down and read your paper, the more they're just going to say, well, no. And so you need to really spell it out for the reviewer as in a straightforward manner as possible. So I wouldn't say I'm going to talk about rules so much as tips about structure that I, both as an editor and a reviewer and an author, I have found very useful. And if there's any one tip I would give you in regards to that, it's that this is not an Agatha Christie novel. So, you read an Agatha Christie novel, at the end, you find out the butler did it. No, this is where you start out telling your reader the butler did it. You then create an entire literature review to prove that the butler did it. Then you run analyses supporting your argument that the butler did it. Then in the discussion section, you remind everyone that people didn't quite realize that the butler did it before, but now your paper is showing, yes, the butler really did it. And so that's sort of the way you want to set it up, is you want to keep reminding the reviewer, and the reader, here's what my main point is. And so what I usually suggest, so the point here is don't hide things. Tell them as early and as clearly as possible. And so what I usually suggest is, well, actually, before I get to that, also something we saw at SMH that I'd always just found so confusing is we wouldn't see an introduction. People would just start writing and to be a part of their literature review. And maybe for other subdisciplines that works. For the kind of work I've edited, I've written, and I've reviewed, that's a disaster. And I still get it as a reviewer. And I'm just sitting there going, wait, what's this paper about? It also goes back to your research question. So usually what I suggest is, first of all, start out with an introduction. And usually what I suggest is a 3-paragraph introduction. The first one should just talk about what you're studying and why it's important to study. And I'm going to go quant in this small part, which is when you're talking about that, typically you want to talk more about the independent variable than dependent variable. So I was editor of a mental health journal. Someone writing to me talking about depression and saying that the World Health Organization says depression is a major issue. It didn't feel like a sociology paper. It felt like a public health paper. So talking about what you're studying and why it's sociologically relevant often was more useful, unless this is some novel mental health outcome that people haven't studied. And even then, you still want to say, here's why it's relevant to sociology. And that's the first paragraph. Just what are you studying and why is it important? And then the second paragraph, you say what's missing. And often that's where you want to briefly mention your theory and say, well, this is missing and it's important, not just because it's been overlooked, but because theory would indicate it's important. And then the third paragraph, you say, here's what I'm going to do. And you finish that third paragraph by saying, thus, the contribution of this research to the literature is up. And you specifically state what your contribution is. And the reason why that's important is because you're not hiding things from reviewers. You're being really upfront. Here's what I'm studying. Here's what's missing. So that's why I'm going to study it. And here's what I'm going to try to contribute to the literature. And so I think those, you don't have to have that 3-paragraph structure, but especially for people starting out, I just think it's really absolutely essential to do, because then you're at least clear with yourself. What am I really trying to show? And oftentimes that 3 paragraphs is what you're going to revise the most, because as you go through your literature review, you're going to go back and revise it. And then as you do your methods, you're going to go back and as so on and so forth. And you're probably going to revise it multiple times as you're working on your literature review, is slowly figure out what's the angle you're going to take and how you're going to frame this paper. But I do think oftentimes, at least papers I've seen, live or die on those first 3 paragraphs.
That was so helpful. And thank you so much for that analogy. That will definitely stick in my mind as I'm writing. So we actually, oh, yeah, did you have something
Yeah,
else?
I would just add a little bit to that. I mean, I think that's fabulous advice for qualitative work too. That intros are so important. Um, but also to that point of having that, and Nicole, to how you feel sort of that maybe confined. I mean, you need. I'm using a lot of music examples. I'm not a musician. I'm not very musical. But if you want to do great improv, you need technical proficiency first. And so what Alex has talked about is technical proficiency that will be successful, right? And then as you go further in your career, gradually you learn a bit more. Where is there room for improv and where is there not? But starting out, your goals as undergrad or graduate students are mastering technical proficiency. And that was great advice that both Alex and Chantelle gave.
That's such a great point to consider as well, and sort of ties in a little bit with a question that actually came in through our Instagram account from a student follower. And they were asking, is there a well-structured article that comes to mind, or one you've turned to as a model that you could recommend to students? And I'll just open the floor up to anyone who would like to answer, because I'm not sure if there is just one article that might come to mind.
That's kind of tough. And one of the reasons I think it's tough is that in the publisher parish model, our structure has become more sedimented. And so a lot of the original works that we might rely on, if you read Weber or Durkheim or Goffman, or even even something 50 years ago, 40 years ago, the structures were less sedimented. And so I really value their work and their concepts, but they're not necessarily spectacular writers. Some are. Um, but I think the rules of the game of the field in sort of a Bourdieusian sense, what you need to be successful, have shifted. So you'd want to look at more recent articles. I think that's the best I can do for that question.
Would anyone like to add to that, or should we just move on to the next question?
I'll just say something really briefly, which is something we said before. So I completely agree with Lisa Jo said. Absolutely. Like if you ever read Morris Rosenberg's work, he was brilliant, but it's nothing you could ever replicate today in terms of how he set it up. But also to say we all said read the journal. So I think the structure is going to come down to who you're submitting to. So, like I said, read the last 3 years of the journal, and you'll get a pretty good sense of what they're looking for in that journal.
Excellent, thank you. So moving on a little bit to terminology, I suppose. We've talked a little bit about desk rejects. There's also R&R that I hear floating around often. Can we maybe talk a little bit just about some of that language and what that means for students who are unfamiliar? And maybe we'll start with Dr. Richmond.
Are we talking about index factors?
Yeah, one of the questions also was like, what are index factors?
You said R&R though.
Well, an R&R, it's another term that I know when I first heard it, everyone was using it as if it was just common knowledge. I'm like, what is everyone talking about? What does R&R?
I'm like thinking rest and relax. I don't know. Okay. Yeah. So index factors, I guess, are important. They, like an index factor, like an H index factor, for example, will tell the audience. So you can create your own account on Google Scholar, and it will, I guess you populate it maybe. I don't remember. It's been a long time. So it will like hold all of your publications. It will indicate how many of your publications have been cited however many times. So if I have, I think my H index factor is somewhere in the 20s, high 20s maybe, which means I have at least, let's say it's like 27 or 25 articles that have been cited at least 25 times. And then of course you have like all-time citations. Like, I don't know how I feel about all of these because you can definitely see if you look at like the historical citations, like some of them are just like going like this, and then some of them don't. um, it's, Alex earlier said like he doesn't do books. Books take a long time to write, and the impact the time to factor in the impact, it's like writing several papers, right? And then also working through the peer review process and the publication of the book and so on, which can be delayed. So that can postpone your index, I guess the impact in your index factor. I think I'm not describing this very well. And maybe I'm going to I don't know, who should go next? Yeah,
Well,
Alex.
you did address that actually really well. Yeah, thank you. Alex, take over.
Thanks for that, Chantelle. I read impact factor a different way. I'm not sure I agree what the question asked. So I've spent a lot of time thinking and researching impact factor, which is why I raised my hand. So when I think of impact factor, that's a way of rating the journal's impact. That's what I think of that. And so where that comes from, I can tell exactly where that comes from is there's several different organizations out there that give you that, but the main one that everybody looks at is by this group called the Journal Citation Reports. And it comes out once a year. And when it comes out, like people will start talking, like there's a bunch of us really nerdy people who are like following that like it's baseball. And so what it basically ends up being is it's an average. And it's the average number of citations a paper in the journal gets, in theory. That's not actually what happens, because what the JCR, Journal Citations Reports, is doing is they're only looking at a paper's, in theory, first 2 years in the journal. And it's kind of like, because we're all working. So we don't necessarily read a paper and immediately go, I gotta cite that. And so that right there is kind of a weird, skewed metric as it is. And so it's basically then an average. On average, how many times will a paper cited in this journal be cited in the first 2 years of a paper's life? from publication. They've recently revised that to also take into account when papers are posted to a website before publication. But that's what that is. So, for example, if your journal says journal site impact factor is 3, what that means is on average, you can expect that paper to be cited 3 times in the first 2 years. And the other thing to remember about that is it's biased because JCR classifies journals in terms of areas. So if you ever look at Google Scholar, oftentimes a paper will have many more citations than this JCR claims. This all comes out of Web of Science, by the way, the Web of Science Index, because Web of Science is really only looking at a limited number of journals that may be citing the similarly relevant field. Whereas, especially when I publish in mental health, that can get published, that gets cited, I should say, all over the place. So that's what people usually mean when they have impact factors, because unfortunately, there's been a movement away from this, but unfortunately, it's still the case that often people want to see high impact factors and you publishing in a high impact journals with high impact factors, I should say. And especially if you're publishing in something below 1, meaning an average of less than 1 citation for your paper, that's generally considered not really worthy. We can have a very long discussion about whether that's even a good idea. It's not. But that is the long and the short of it. I don't know if you want to keep going and talk about R&Rs and that sort of thing, but I feel like I'm monopolizing the conversation. So I'm going to pause right here and I can talk more if you'd like me to.
Maybe we'll move over to Dr. Vanden Scott to ask about like desk rejection
Sure.
specifically,
Yeah.
and R&R, which I was thinking revise and resubmit. So
Yes. Well, I mean, and the H index and the impact factor are interesting. The impact factor measuring the journal, H index provided by Google Scholar to sort of reflect. But as Alex mentioned and Chantelle mentioned, that there are problems with those. That's a different conversation. And much like public sociology, when we talk about if a website gets so many hits, that's really good. But what if you're studying a really unsexy yet important topic? So there's all these kinds of things. But when you send your paper in, so I'm checking my portal, I've got a bunch of things sent in. I look at it. One of the challenges I find as an editor is that a lot of the new systems are set up to consider authors untrustworthy. And so one of the challenges that I find is it wants me we're in a Wiley platform. They've switched to Research Exchange from Manuscript Central. You don't need to remember that, people who want to publish, but I'll have uh, doubts about the author's existence, research concerns, and I have like 50 things I can check that are all accusatory, really. And then I have one that I can check that's out of scope. So I'm usually checking that one for a desk reject, to be honest. But anyway, I read it and I go, oh, why have we been advertised so widely when we're a pretty niche journal? We don't do philosophy of engineering. And so I'll desk reject and I'll click out of scope and I'll write a little note saying, this is out of scope for these reasons. And if it's a field that I know, like, because I have other areas of expertise, then I'll say you might consider Social Psychology Quarterly, for example, or Social Forces, or Qualitative Sociology Review. That's a more general qualitative journal, something like, so I might do that. But you'll get sort of a note, and you should know that usually the majority of that note is a template. And so again, if you get a desk reject, don't take it personally. It's not that, right? And so that's desk reject is a lot. There is a category that some platforms have it available to click and some not, and it's called rejection with invitation to resubmit. This is very unusual to get, but for example, sometimes I'll get something and it's really a good fit with the journal, but it's missing a major piece or it's just underdeveloped. It's not ready to go for review. I could send it for review, but I know it's going to get panned and it's just not ready. So I might put on my mentorship hat and write a little like, this is not ready. I'm desk rejecting it. However, if you undertake these extreme revisions, you can resubmit it as a new submission. Please make sure you cite this manuscript number in your cover letter and go forward. And then that helps me because then I can go back and see the progress they've made, and it makes me actually more partial to it because now I see the work I've invested in it already. And so that's a category that you may encounter. It's much less common, but it's people do rejects with invitation to resubmit. Then, if the editor is either it's borderline or the editor thinks maybe it has a chance, we'll see what the reviewers say. I don't know. There's a number of reasons. I don't want to sort of read into the motivations of all editors, but you send it out and the reviewers look at it and they say it's not ready, it has these problems, it has these flaws, X, Y, or Z, or maybe they don't feel it's a good fit. Whatever reasons the reviewers have, they come back to the editor and the editor rejects it. So that's a plain old reject, not a desk reject. A desk reject is when it does not go to the reviewers. It's not ready to be seen by reviewers, or it's totally not fit for the journal. Not a fit for the journal, not fit for the journal. Then, so a reject means reviewers have seen it and it's a no-go. And so that's it. Then the most common outcome for a paper that will eventually get published is major revision. So that's an R&R, revise and resubmit. So you can get a revise and resubmit that involves major revisions, and that's quite common. If you get a major revision or an R&R that includes major revisions, take yourself out for a coffee, celebrate, read the reviews, then let them sit for a day or two while you choke on your anger because it was your perfect baby and it's being criticized, and then come back and suck it up and do your revisions. But it's good news if you have a revise and resubmit. It is not an accept. It can still get rejected moving forward. That does happen. So don't take yourself out to dinner yet. Just go get a coffee. And then it really depends on how well you address the reviewer's concerns. But the editor believes it has potential and that there's a possibility you'll be able to do that and that it would successfully move forward. Then there's also revise and resubmit with minor revisions. So you can get multiple R&Rs, revise and resubmits, on the same paper, same manuscript, over and over. We often call it manuscript before it's accepted for publication. We don't like to call it an article before it gets published, in part because articles are published. So it's sort of a definition. So your manuscript could go through a number of revise and resubmits. If you get a major revision and then your next one is a minor revision, that take yourself for a coffee and a donut, and so, but then buckle down, address those revisions and send it in again. And then eventually minor revisions is very good news. Still, occasionally we do have authors who fail to grasp what the reviewer is saying. That can happen. So, don't go for dinner yet. Just now add the donut. Then you get an accept. Sometimes it's a conditional or a provisional accept, and that usually means it's something like, if you fix this one problem we noticed, then we're good to go. It does not need to go back out to reviewers, but you just need to fix this thing, right? And then there's accept. Now go out to dinner and enjoy it, because at some point you're going to hit copy edits and page proofs, and that'll be kind of a headache. It's fine, but yeah. So, and then most journals now have an early view online where it gets published online before it gets assigned to an issue. I will say that it's entirely context dependent on the journal, whether or not, once it's had some positive reviews, whether or not they feel, say, after a minor revision, if it's going to go back to the reviewers or not. Some journals are more inclined to send it for more rounds of review. Other journals, they feel inclined to say, well, I, as an editor, see that the reviewers were fairly positive. They said minor revisions. I think they addressed those changes. I'm going to go forward with it. So that's really, it depends on the journal. So there's no sort of standard thing I can tell you about that. But that's what all those words mean. And that's kind of what the process is and all of the most common steps of the process.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. And just really quickly, Dr. Bierman, I know Dr. Richmond does have to leave at 3 o'clock. Thank you so much for being here. You've offered such great information. And did you want to just share any last thoughts with us?
Of course, I always do. I have I gotta go, but I just one more minute. I just want to say how nice it was to be here. I wish I could see the students' faces because I honestly I love these sorts of events. One really quick thing I wanted to respond to was the response to reviews. So when you are given the opportunity to revise your manuscript, you probably also get an opportunity to write a letter or write some piece that explains what you did in the manuscript to change it. You should be as specific as you can and help your reviewers see the places where you've changed those things. Writing a really excellent response to reviewers. Your supervisor, other mentors that you know probably have good examples that you could have a look at and then, try to emulate. That honestly, that is again the roadmap. Make the story as easy as possible to read and understand everywhere. Alex talked about this in those 3 paragraphs intro. Yeah, you're not writing the mystery novel. You want to shout from the rooftops what you've learned, how you did it, and in each, piece of the puzzle, in each piece of the story, the manuscript, you're just writing clearly. I will honestly, I shouldn't say I make decisions, but often when I'm a reviewer on scholarships, grants, when I'm reading publications, like if I can see in the first page, like I'm brought into the story, it just helps me tremendously. And it's like I want to read more. Right. And so you really have to take the time to like bring your reader in and so that they can they're with you. They're with you on the journey. If you're fighting to understand, that's a really bad thing. So I just also want to say to all of the students on the line that you you have a tremendous number of people around you, your supervisor, your committee, past professors, new professors. I would ask for help from all of these different sources. They will all have something different to tell you. And I think when you start to put those pieces together, sometimes you have to hear things many times. Like I don't learn the first time. I take like five times until I'm like, oh, right. And that's okay because that is the learning process. And I just want to say to everybody, like, this is a learning process and each stage really matters. And I cannot reiterate that technical piece, like learning to be technically proficient, right? Learning to write the intro, learning to follow the guidelines, like all of those things will help you tremendously. And so I'm going to go. Thank you very much to my co-presenters and to Nicole and to Sherry and to all of you. Have a great weekend.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richmond.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And Dr. Bierman, you did raise your hand before. Did you want to jump in and add to that as well?
I just wanted to build on what Lisa Jo was talking about because, we did the same thing. It was interesting to listen to Lisa Jo because let me tell you, Lisa Jo's process, very similar to what we did at SMH. So there is a pretty common process here, but just 2 things I wanted to talk about here, or 3. First of all, so let's say the editor reads the paper and decides, okay, it's at least somewhere in our area, so it deserves, and it's at least, a baseline competently done, deserves to be reviewed. So one thing I want to talk about is what the reviewer is going to do is they're going to look for the editor, I should say, is going to look for reviewers. And that could be you typically 2 to 4 reviewers. And so that could be people who you were citing, people who are very familiar with that work, or it could be a generalist. So something we really hit at SMH was often, partially because we had trouble finding reviewers, but often because there was a certain sense of, well, yeah, we can talk to person A who knows about this specific topic, but we're supposed to be talking to the sociology of mental health. So let's get somebody who's more senior, more accomplished in the field, maybe not in that specific thing, but to talk about, does this meet a contribution to the field? So you want to think about that's who the reviewer, that's who the editor is looking for. And the second thing is, keep in mind that the the reviewers are more important than the author. Because the editor needs those reviewers again. So typically, if there's a disagreement between the editor and I should say, between the reviewers and the author, um, the editor is going to hedge their bets and go with the reviewer unless you can really show that what the reviewer is talking about is incorrect. So typically, you want to basically, when you have that response that Chantelle was talking about, you want to be careful. First of all, be respectful. I have seen people go at reviewers strongly. It's never successful. And also, don't just argue, even if you're right, don't just argue with reviewers. We had multiple cases where the author was probably right, but they didn't change their paper at all. And the reviewer came back and said, I don't know what to do here because they didn't change a darn thing. And it's kind of like, okay, I agree with you, you know. And sometimes the reviewers had real points, but at the same time, you want to be careful not to lose yourself in that revision process. There was one paper I did that I really, to this day, regret ceding to the reviewer's demand so much because I think it lost what would have been a really persuasive point. So it was still a contribution. It got published, but it just didn't quite have the impact, I think, in terms of readership it should have. Anyway, so you want to be, it's kind of a game that you need to play and figure out what's the hill you're going to die on, so to speak. Like, where are you really not going to change something? But otherwise, really do try to meet the reviewer's comments. And the last thing I want to talk about is, so when reviewers review a paper, they actually submit two things. They submit typically a bulleted set of points that the author sees, but then they also submit something to the editor that the authors don't see. Keep in mind, those two may not necessarily be musical expression, harmony. Those two may not be in harmony. Maybe people are, I've, at least as a reviewer, once I had a paper that was, I found infuriating. It just basically, not only was it bad methods, it like purposely misquoted other authors. I thought it was, I'd love to tell you who that author was, but I'm going to keep my mouth shut on that. But anyway, the upshot is that I was very respectful in the comments to the author, and then to the editor basically was like furious with this author, and the editor actually thanked me for my professionalism. So I think I made the right call. But the upshot is, just keep in mind, if you get these reviews back and it gets rejected, even on like after an R&R, it gets rejected, you may see there saying, well, the comments are fairly respectful, and it's like, yeah, to you. To the editor, it may have been a different discussion. So just, don't take it personally. You didn't see the full picture. You'll never see the full picture. Move down the apple tree to the next journal. Oh, last thing. And keep in mind, you may have some of the same reviewers if you submit to another journal, but you also may have different journals. So don't spend your time too much trying to respond to every single thing the previous reviewer said. If you go to a different journal, try to have a good contribution. And if there were major issues, address those. All right. That's what I'm going to say there.
This is so helpful, and I'm learning so much today. So thank you for your insight into kind of what happens behind the scenes as well, which I think is really, really useful. So I'm going to switch over to some questions from the audience right now. And just for all of the audience members, remember that there is the Q&A function down on the toolbar at the bottom. So if you would like to ask a question, please submit it there. So the first question from the audience is, given that graduate students have finite levels of energy and time amidst competing demands, is there added value on a CV in trying to pump out alternative publications, such as book reviews, the conversation pieces, public think pieces, etc., in addition to own published papers? Or would it be more optimal to put all your effort into publishing papers and not dividing your time on smaller writing pieces? And maybe Dr. Vanden Scott, will start with you.
Sure. That one's a bit challenging because sometimes it depends on your field, your specialty area. Sometimes it depends on what kind of institution you want to be placed at eventually. So there's not a really good one-size-fits-all answer to this. What I will say is that it's great to have a book review on your CV. Go for it. If you have 7 book reviews on your CV, someone's going to look at that CV and go, they could have published 3 articles instead or something, right? So I do think it is good to have some of these things on your CV, but once you have a book review on your CV, you can be done with book reviews unless a specific opportunity arises. But you've shown you can do that. It's more important to have published pieces, I think. But again, it's hard to say one size fits all. Alex might have a different experience in his field. So I do think it's good to do those things. But I think keep in mind, if you spend all your time doing that, you may lose out on the other front. Having said that, a lot of universities in their collective agreements are putting more language in to acknowledge creative outputs as research, to acknowledge public engagement as more of a research load. So it's very hard. It kind of depends. Are you aiming for a research intensive university? Are you aiming to be at an undergraduate university where that doesn't have graduate students and be more teaching focused or public engagement focused? So what I would say is number one, talk to your supervisor, talk to people around you, talk to people in your field so that you can get advice specific to your area and your field. Um, Second is um, the so for publishing papers, there's also the book chapter road. And I some books are peer reviewed, some edited collections are peer reviewed, and some are less qualified as peer reviewed. And so it's important on your CV when you're starting out. I'm very, very privileged to be in the position where I don't bother marking if it's peer reviewed or not now. But when you're starting out, if you have book chapters, it is good to indicate whether they're peer reviewed or not, because some book chapters are, some aren't, and a journal article tends to be sort of worth more weight on your CV than a book chapter. Um, but this also pairs with things like some areas of sociology. If you don't have any solo authored publications, you you know that's it's not good. Other areas of sociology, why would you have a solo authored publication? So these are things that you really need to talk to people in your field. Begin with your supervisor, but don't be shy about approaching people at conferences in your field. A really nice thing to do is before a conference, see who's presenting in your field, whom you want to connect with, email them 3 weeks before the conference and say, I'd really love to have a chat. Can we get a coffee? When might you be available? And set up time. And you can ask them these kinds of questions. You want to seek mentorship everywhere you can, um, but always default to your supervisor.
That's great advice. Thank you for sharing that. And I know a lot of students have written to the Student Concern Subcommittee specifically talking about networking and conferences. So it's good to know that it's not, I guess, frowned upon to reach out to folks before conferences and get the conversation going prior to. So thank you. And Dr. Bierman, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just respond briefly and say, from my perspective, as someone who's really focused on more research intensive universities, if that's what you're trying to get a tenure track position in a more research focused university like University of Calgary, something like that, even book reviews don't really help you. I'm not even a fan of book chapters. I think, especially where you are, in terms of starting out, you need to show you can get in the peer-reviewed journals. And now maybe it's a little different if you're the kind of, again, Lisa Jo was so correct in that it really is context dependent, because there may be other fields that I'm less engaged in, where especially if you're from a field where maybe books more published, maybe that book review is more helpful, that sort of thing. But for me, I want to see, are you getting into the peer review journals, especially larger, more major journals? Yes, that involves that impact factor. I'm very sorry. And so that's, I think, where you should be spending your time. As far as the conversation goes, that's an interesting question, because what you can do is publish a conversation piece based on your published research. So that's where I suggest that would come in. The nice thing with the conversation is they track how many views they have. So I will put in my CV, oh, this was viewed by 20,000 people. I mean, that shows you're making headway with knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization, that sort of side of things. So I think, even book chapters often, even if they are peer reviewed, it's not the same thing as as what you get from a journal. If it's some major, major chapter, like I did the Handbook of Sociology and Mental Health, that was a big deal getting in that book for people who were in it. And like some junior scholar, not some, but a junior scholar who got in it emailed me just a effusive thank you for inviting them to be part of it because it was such an honor to be a part of that. So if you're getting in that, maybe that's useful. But even then, it's a question of you're not going to do that by yourself. You're going to do it with your mentor. And then it's a question of was that them or that was their mentor? So really, it is, I think, a good idea to just aim for that peer-reviewed journal literature to show you can do it. And it was interesting that Lisa Jo mentioned sole authoring. In the kind of perspectives I have, sole authoring is very often a very good idea because it shows you can work independently of your supervisor. Maybe it's different again in other fields. So, here's two different perspectives from people who work in two different areas. And so, as Lisa Jo said, I think it's a really good idea. This is a good idea to let your supervisor guide you on this one.
I think those are some great points. Um, and one thing I would add is that the CV, when you're being evaluated, one of the things, there's all the publications, but that sense of momentum, right? And so, how do you indicate a sense of momentum? When you're being hired, people want to know, do you have a research program that will carry you forward, that your publications that you do have aren't just sort of it, right? What are you going to do moving forward? So, something like the conversation, having pieces in there, as Alex mentioned, for me, what that shows is momentum, right? This sort of building. You want to sense a building. Even committee work, things like that. You want to show some, you don't have to, as graduate students, don't take on a ton of committee work. This is not what I'm saying. But you want to show, for example, we're at a CSA event here from a student subcommittee. If you show you're involved with an organization, even a little bit, that to me is a piece of the momentum, but it's not a piece of momentum that will carry you beyond people who've published more, right? So it's sort of um, something to keep in mind, but let the publications guide you. I'm also from a field where solo authored, if you have no solo authored publications, I start to wonder, and especially if all your publications are with your supervisor. If you're going to co-author, it's good to get some other, when I was a grad student, I thought, I should experience what it's like publishing with a peer before I graduate. Because when I published with faculty, which I was at a university where they were very generous and published a lot with their students, I thought, well, I need to know how to operate when I'm not the subordinate, when there's a power balance. And so a couple of peers and I went off and we did a research project together that was not too onerous, but a lot of fun. And we all studied really serious topics, and then we went and looked at reality TV. And for a while, that was kind of embarrassingly one of my most cited articles, not anymore. But, um, but I think like that as a co-authored piece held more weight than a piece I'd co-authored with my supervisor.
That's so helpful. And it's funny you mentioned reality TV because that's my go-to to sort of decompress from the very serious research. And it's fascinating to me as a sociologist to watch reality TV. So,
We coined the term eulogy work about when they get voted off. Have a read. It's a lot of fun.
oh, that's
Some
fantastic.
shameless self-promotion.
I just want to make a note to the audience because we have lots of questions coming in and we are getting low on time. So again, this is part one of a two-part series. So I will make note of all of the questions coming in and any of the ones that we don't get to today. We will make sure to add to our list of questions for our February part two. So audience members, if I don't get to your question today, it is coming. Stay tuned. Okay, that said, there is a question about responding to reviewers when receiving an R&R. If you disagree with a reviewer's comment, or if you believe the point they raised has already been addressed in your paper, how would you recommend responding to it? Dr. Bierman, did you want to start us off with that one?
I think we both are like, oh, go for it.
Lisa, actually, I'll let you go first and I'll see if I have anything of value to add after
Oh,
that.
if you're sure. I mean,
Yeah, go for it.
okay. You got to suck it up. Sorry. I'm so sorry, but that's what you have to do. Unless it's a point of integrity, in which case you can push back a bit. That's, but you do have to create, in any case, there'll be a place when you send your revision for you to put in a response to reviewers. So you can go through an address. As Chantelle had said, you very clearly articulate how you responded to each comment from the reviewers. Make it as easy as possible on the overburdened editors and associate editors who will be looking at that because they want to be able to get through it, right? Um, but I will say, if, I mean, when it's the case of, I explained that though, right? The issue is maybe you did. However, if a reviewer didn't get it, keep in mind there will be lots of other people like that reviewer who maybe don't have the same amount of experience with reality TV or know why you would want to publish on it, or maybe don't like country music and your piece is on country music, or maybe you're doing something about Instagram, or Snapchat, which I call InstaChat in class to get a laugh, but it points out that not everybody is totally familiar with everything you're going to study. And so if that reviewer is missing your point, you need to make your point more clear, even if you feel you've already done that and said that. So you need to elaborate on it. You need to imagine I could be writing a paper on what is it, the World of Warcraft or whatever game, who is to somebody who's never seen a video game like that, or a point of view video game. See, I don't even know what I'm talking about, clearly. So I would need a lot of description, right? And so that reviewer is not just a reviewer, but they represent a portion of the readership of that journal. And so if they're struggling, you will have other readers that struggle. So you need to take those comments seriously, even if they burn, even if you feel you've already done that. It sucks, but you got to suck it up and just do it unless there's like an integrity. That's an asterisk there.
Absolutely. Everything that Lisa Jo said, and it doesn't matter if it's quantitative or qualitative research, everything that Lisa Jo said is absolutely broadly applicable. I'll just make two extra notes, which is, reviewers are human too. I have definitely had papers where the reviewer just didn't do their job. They just didn't. There was something where I not only explained something in words, I also drew a picture. And I don't know how much more straightforward you can get than that. And they still 100% missed what they were talking about. And it happens. You just have to go, oh, thank you. That's a good point. Well, I've refined how I explained this. But, and that's kind of what you just have to do. And so yeah, you just got to hold your bile and it is what it is. But the other side of this, I will say, and I think this goes to Lisa's point as well in terms of ethics, is I do work a lot in a sphere of advanced quantitative analysis. And it's funny because when I was coming up in grad school, I always assumed, oh, it's the advanced quant stuff that who's just like, ooh, it's dazzling. And I've actually the opposite happens. Reviewers are much more likely to say, I don't like this because I don't know what it is. And will either you can tell they're not liking it and wanting to reject it just because they don't feel comfortable with it. And at times they'll even suggest a methodology that doesn't match. And because they're more comfortable with this older style methodology. And that is the one point where I do think you have to sit down and say to yourself, do I want this in the literature with my name on it if this doesn't match what I think the appropriate way to do something is? And again, this is a great place to talk to your supervisor. How do I negotiate this specific issue that Lisa, Joe, and I can't advise you on? But also, can I, I'm wanting to do a multi-level model and they're telling me to do a generalized estimation equation. Are those the same thing? Is that close enough? And your advisor can probably help you negotiate that in ways that maybe you just need some experience and some seasoning to really figure out how to work that way. And it may just mean, unfortunately, you say, I'm going to take a stand here. I have done that with my research partners in a couple of papers the last couple of years where we just said, it came back to a second R&R and we finally just said, no, we've explained this in depth to the reviewer. No, we're not doing this. It's not, I don't want this, my name on this paper if we do what the reviewer wants. But again, talk to your supervisor first before you go that kind of step.
And I would say those are great points. And I would add the sort of equivalent that I see in qualitative work is, for example, you might submit a paper on deviance and you get a reviewer who's crim as an example, or vice versa. You submit a crim paper and you have a reviewer who's deviance, and they're just like, this paper should be from my field's point of view, exact. So a good editor will kind of balance that out. So definitely read closely the letter that you get from the editor with a decision, because they will often code things in there, like pay particular attention to reviewer two means the editor probably didn't think reviewer one's comments were great. Maybe they were too short, or maybe they didn't, whatever. Um, you still have to be, put up the show of like almighty reviewer one and two, but it's pay attention to that letter because you will see what the editor wants and what they think of those reviewers. That's kind of a trick of the trade.
All right, we are getting close to time. So again, just a reminder to audience members, I am noting your questions and we will address them at the next webinar. But I was thinking maybe for a closing question, you could both maybe speak to what are some of the most common mistakes that you've seen as editorial board members for paper submissions? Or alternatively, maybe answer if there's one tip that you have to offer students before signing out today, what would that tip of advice be? And I will open it up to either of you who would like to go first.
Thank you. I will keep it brief so you can get. Okay, common mistakes. Sending it to two journals at the same time. You're not allowed to do that. Do not do that. If nobody has told you that yet, don't do that. And we know about it because all the systems are linked, and that's an immediate reject with research concerns, right? So just in case nobody said that. I think the most common mistake I get is that people are unfamiliar with the journal and send in things that are totally not a fit for the journal. So we've talked a lot about that, so I'll just leave it at that, but that is the biggest mistake. So become familiar with the journal you're submitting to, and but also have a few journals in mind, as Alex had suggested earlier. The one last thing I'll say, I noticed there was a question about imposter syndrome, and we don't have time to really address that in this section, but I'm just telling you, your faculty have imposter syndrome. They're just really good at faking it. And often, if they're part of a marginalized group of whatever kind, that imposter syndrome feels heightened. And if you feel imposter syndrome, it's called imposter syndrome because it's a syndrome. It's not reality. And often, if you're faced with reality, it still won't go away. My father came from below the working poor. He was poor, not poor, poor, right? In Holland during the Second World War, with hospitalized for starvation. He became a professor, and to the day he retired, he thought the RCMP were going to show up at his door and escort him out because there had been some sort of mistake. He was very well known, is very well known, and he helped draft the first TCPS. Like, you know, all the accomplishments in the world. You have to know we all feel that and we're with you. Okay.
Dr.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just say that really, I think the biggest mistake that I saw at SMH, Society of Mental Health, was just people who didn't, basically what Lisa just said, they hadn't read the journal. They were just throwing a mental health paper at us. You really need to craft your paper so that if it's a sociology journal, so the sociological contribution is very clear, and craft it for the audience of the journal you're submitting it to. And I think because we're tight on time, I think I'll just reinforce that point. Thanks, Lisa Jo.
Thank you both so much for being here. Honestly, I can't thank you enough. We have discussed so much today, and I'm really glad that we are having a part 2 in February as well. I'm just going to send in the chat to all of the audience members. If you do have any questions for the Student Concern Subcommittee, either about anything that was brought up in the webinar today or anything else, our email address is now in the chat. You can also find the Student Concern Subcommittee and some of the activities and upcoming webinars on the website, also included in the chat. And if you are on Instagram and would like to follow us there, I've put our handle in the chat as well. So once again, Dr. Bierman, Dr. Vandenscott, thank you so, so much for this incredibly helpful, knowledgeable, and wonderful panel today. And I see lots of thank yous in the chat as well. Thank you also to our Executive Director, Sherry Fox, for helping with all of the technical aspects and helping with the promotion of this webinar. I think it's been such a success. And again, I can't thank you both enough for being here today. Thank you.